On the 18th of March, 1890, Otto von Bismarck formally submitted his resignation to Kaiser Wilhelm II. Wilhelm accepted it 2 days later. Bismarck had unified Germany, defeated Austria, crushed France, and spent the following 19 years keeping the most powerful state in Europe out of a two-front war, through a web of secret treaties and mutual assurances so carefully balanced that it required his constant personal manipulation to prevent collapse. Wilhelm was 31 years old, had been Kaiser for less than 2 years, and had already decided that Bismarck's system of careful restraint was incompatible with the Germany he intended to build. 24 years later, Germany was at war on every front Bismarck had spent his life preventing. Between 15 and 20 million people would be dead before it ended. You've probably spent more time thinking about Adolf Hitler's responsibility for the Second World War than you have about Wilhelm's responsibility for the First. That's understandable. Hitler planned his war. Wilhelm stumbled into his. And that distinction, which seems to favor Wilhelm, is exactly what this video is going to take apart. Subscribe if you want history that follows the evidence rather than the mythology. This argument makes most people uncomfortable because it doesn't let the Kaiser hide behind incompetence. Incompetence at this scale, with this much to lose, is its own indictment. If you've watched our video on why Hitler started the war before Germany was ready, this is the upstream answer. The decisions made between 1890 and 1914 that built the conditions making everything that followed possible. Start with what each man was given, because the gap between inheritance and outcome is where responsibility lives. Hitler came to power in January 1933 at the bottom of the worst economic catastrophe in modern German history. Unemployment was above 30%. The Weimar Republic's governing coalition had collapsed. The Nazi Party had risen from obscurity to the largest party in the Reichstag in 3 years, feeding on a population that had watched its savings destroyed twice in a decade, first by hyperinflation, then by depression. Hitler consolidated power because the democratic system had already broken down around him. Versailles had stripped Germany of territory, military capacity, and national confidence. The men who would staff Hitler's officer corps had spent 15 years in a humiliated army capped at 100,000 men. Hitler didn't create those conditions. He weaponized them. Wilhelm inherited a country that was whole and still managed to break it. He took the throne in 1888 with no serious enemies and no existential threats, something no German ruler before him had ever been able to say. The great powers treated Germany as the indispensable center of European diplomacy. Every major negotiation ran through Berlin. Bismarck had arranged it that way deliberately, and it held as long as Bismarck was in the room. Wilhelm had more strategic options in 1890 than Germany would ever have again. He closed them, one by one. The case against Wilhelm isn't that he wanted a world war. The historical consensus, fairly solid, is that he didn't. What he wanted was prestige, deference, and a German empire that commanded the same respect as the British one. What he built was the exact coalition that would destroy Germany, through 5 decisions spread across 24 years, each one looking reasonable at the time, each one making the next catastrophe slightly harder to avoid. The first was quiet enough that most people miss it. In 1890, Wilhelm and his new chancellor allowed the reinsurance treaty with Russia to lapse, convinced by Foreign Office bureaucrats that the secret agreement was fundamentally incompatible with Germany's obligations to Austria-Hungary. It seemed like a reasonable housekeeping decision. Tidy up Bismarck's complicated mess, simplify the diplomatic architecture. Within 4 years, Russia had signed a military alliance with France. The two-front war Bismarck had spent his entire diplomatic career preventing was now structurally in place, built in less time than it had taken Bismarck to prevent it. The second decision was louder, much louder. Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz presented Wilhelm with the risk fleet theory in 1898. Build a navy large enough that Britain couldn't attack it without unacceptable losses, and Britain would stay neutral in any European conflict. Wilhelm approved it immediately. His personal obsession with naval power was documented by everyone who dealt with him, rooted partly in jealousy of his British cousins, partly in the belief that a fleet was the mark of great power status. Britain's response was not what Tirpitz had modelled. The revolutionary dreadnought program launched in 1906 made all existing battleships obsolete overnight, including Britain's own, and forced both empires into a ruinously expensive arms race Germany could not sustain at pace. The Entente Cordiale with France came in 1904. The Anglo-Russian Convention followed in 1907. In 9 years, Tirpitz's fleet had pushed Britain from cautious neutrality into active alliance with both of Germany's continental rivals. The high seas fleet that justified all of this would fight one major battle at Jutland in 1916, achieve a tactical draw, and spend the rest of the war in harbour until its crews mutinied. The third and fourth decisions reveal something about Wilhelm's character that the first two don't, because they're almost farcical. The Moroccan crises of 1905 and 1911. Both times, Wilhelm inserted German prestige into French colonial affairs. Both times, he backed down under pressure. Both times, the practical effect was cementing Anglo-French military cooperation that hadn't existed before. The 1911 crisis produced the first serious joint Anglo-French military planning conversations, the kind that would determine where British troops landed in August 1914. Germany's assertiveness had built the alliance it was asserting against. He did this twice. The fifth decision was July 1914, and this is where the pattern stops being tragicomic and becomes something else entirely. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand on the 28th of June was a genuine crisis, but it was a Balkan crisis. Serbia, Austria-Hungary and Russia were the primary actors. Germany's involvement was optional. Wilhelm made it mandatory. The blank check, Germany's unconditional guarantee of support for whatever Austria-Hungary decided to do, was issued on the 5th of July. Wilhelm approved it personally, as did Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, who calculated that a swift Austrian victory over Serbia would shatter the Entente before Russia could respond. Neither man had gamed out what happened if that calculation was wrong. Wilhelm then left for his annual summer cruise in the Norwegian fjords. What followed was an agonizing week of telegrams, missed chances, and a crisis moving faster than any diplomat could stop it. On the 29th of July, Wilhelm received the first of several cables from his cousin Tsar Nicholas II, written in English between two men who had known each other since childhood, proposing direct negotiations to halt the escalation before it became irreversible. Wilhelm read them. He wrote notes in the margins. He changed nothing. Then, on the 1st of August, a misleading telegram from the German ambassador in London suggested Britain might stay neutral if Germany confined its attack to Russia alone. Wilhelm saw a way out. He ordered his chief of the general staff, Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, to halt the Western invasion and redirect the entire army east. Moltke stared at him. "It cannot be done," he said. "The deployment of millions cannot be improvised." The railway timetables, the intricate logistical machinery that made German mobilization function, could not be reversed once set in motion. "Your uncle would have given me a different answer." He was right. But the uncle was dead, the machine was running, and the war Wilhelm had spent 24 years accidentally building had just become impossible to stop. The standard defense of Wilhelm is that he didn't plan this. He stumbled into it. He was erratic, vainglorious, incapable of holding a policy together longer than it suited him, but not deliberate. Hitler, by contrast, planned the Second World War with documented precision. The annexation of Austria, the destruction of Czechoslovakia, the invasion of Poland, all planned. The Holocaust was not a byproduct of war. It was an objective. That comparison seems to end the argument before it begins. It doesn't. Because responsibility is not only about intention, it is also about agency. The gap between what you had, what you chose, and what those choices produced. Hitler's rise required a specific sequence of disasters, none of which he caused. Take any one of them away, and the story ends differently. Without Versailles, there's no humiliation to exploit. Without the hyperinflation of 1923, there's no radicalized middle class. Without the Depression of 1929, the electoral collapse that brought him to power doesn't happen. Hitler needed every one of those conditions, exploited all of them with real skill, and created none of them. Wilhelm had no such excuse. Germany in 1890 was not a broken state waiting for a demagogue. It was the most powerful, most stable, most diplomatically sophisticated state in Europe, and Wilhelm had more room to maneuver than any German leader before or since. He could have renewed the reinsurance treaty, restrained the naval build-up, refused the blank check. Every one of those decisions was his to make. He made all of them the wrong way. Some historians argue structural forces made a European war inevitable regardless of who was in charge. The nationalist pressures, the rigid alliances, the momentum of industrial mobilization. That argument isn't wrong, but Bismarck had spent 19 years proving it wasn't inevitable. His system was designed specifically to hold those pressures without collapse. It worked as long as he ran it. Wilhelm inherited that system intact, and every decision that dismantled it required his personal approval. None of them were forced on him. What happened between 1890 and 1914 wasn't bad luck. Wilhelm had every possible way out. He took none of them. Hitler stood trial in 1945. Not personally, of course. He died in Berlin before the Allied armies arrived, but his inner circle faced the Nuremberg Tribunal, and the framework of individual criminal responsibility for aggressive war was established in direct response to what his government had done. Wilhelm died in Dutch exile in 1941. He spent his final years chopping wood on his estate at Dawn, writing self-justifying memoirs, and sending Hitler a congratulatory telegram after the fall of France in 1940. Apparently, seeing it as a vindication of German power rather than a symptom of everything he had set in motion. When Kristallnacht happened in 1938, Wilhelm privately called it a disgrace and said Germany had done something no civilized country would do. He said it privately, then sent the congratulatory telegram anyway. The Allies wanted to try Wilhelm after the war. Article 227 of the Versailles Treaty named him personally, a war criminal to be prosecuted before an international tribunal. The Dutch refused to hand him over, and with that, the case simply disappeared, swallowed by the same stumbling into war narrative that had already taken hold in the diplomatic histories being written. It was a convenient story for everyone involved. It let German generals argue the politicians had failed them. It let Allied governments avoid examining their own mobilization decisions. It let Wilhelm write his memoirs in peace. What he actually did, from Bismarck's dismissal to the blank check in July 1914, was never attached to his name in any public forum. The honest answer is harder than the popular one. Hitler is the defining symbol of political evil in the modern world because his evil was visible, ideological, and deliberate. The Holocaust, the planning, the intent, all of it documented, all of it traceable to a single man's decisions. That clarity makes accountability possible, and it makes the historical verdict feel complete. Wilhelm's failure was produced by something harder to name, a leader who had every advantage, squandered all of them, and never once saw the collapse coming. That's harder to prosecute. It's also harder to stop. A regime that requires active malice to produce catastrophe can, in theory, be stopped by stopping the malicious actor. One that collapses through accumulated bad judgment, institutional drift, and a leader who never recognized the damage he was causing, that gives you almost nothing to grab onto before it's too late. Wilhelm built the conditions for the First World War. The First World War built the conditions for the Second. The Second built the conditions for Nuremberg. And Nuremberg built a legal framework for prosecuting exactly that kind of leader, while Wilhelm walked away without ever standing in a dock. Nobody designed that gap deliberately. It's just that the law we built after the worst war in history was shaped by the war that came second, not the one that made it possible. The worst war in human history was planned by one man who bears direct personal responsibility for genocide on an industrial scale. Nothing in this video changes that. Wilhelm walked into a war he spent 2 decades accidentally building, from a position of complete strength, with every option available and every exit left unused. If Nuremberg had existed in 1919, if the world had built that kind of accountability after the First World War instead of the Second, does Wilhelm stand trial? Drop your answer below. Subscribe if this changed how you think about who actually built the 20th century's catastrophe. Thanks for watching.